story of this book begins in 1920. In 1920, Paramount Pictures decided to open a new studio in New York City. I mean, they had moved most of their operation to the West Coast. They still wanted to maintain a certain amount of activity in the East for a lot of reasons. This studio became what Paramount called a miniature Hollywood in the East, right? They put many of their most important stars to work here. Rudolph Valentino, Gloria Swanson, the Marx Brothers, D.W. Griffith. Later on, independent films in the 1930s by people like Paul Robeson and Ben Hecht were made there. I spent most of my time trying to recollect the history of this place. I didn't know that New York film had its own history. I thought, well, there were a few films made in the East. This is what I had been taught in graduate school, right? Film started in the East. There was Thomas Edison and the Nickelodeon studios. And then by 1915, it all went to the West Coast. The 20s, the 30s, and 40s, this black hole. It's what everyone is told didn't happen. There was no film industry in New York then, right? So I said, if I can write that part, then I'll be able to demonstrate that you can link the cinema of Woody Allen and Spike Lee and Sidney Lumet and Martin Scorsese with D.W. Griffith and Thomas Edison and the Biograph Company. And it wasn't just like a coincidence, oh, they happened to be here, so they made films. There has to be this linkage that you can show. What had moved to Hollywood by World War I was not most of the production of feature-length films. And feature-length films are the glamorous part of the industry, what critics and audiences think of as the real movies. What stayed in the East was the executive offices. All the decisions were made in the East, right? Nonfiction, documentary, and newsreel always stayed in the East. Animation largely stayed in the East. Popeye and Betty Boop. In the 1930s, most short film production in America was made in and around New York. The problem in the 30s was you could make an independent film in New York, but you couldn't get it distributed. You couldn't get it into the good theaters because the good theaters were linked to the Hollywood studios. So, yeah, they might show your film, but not in terms that were economically favorable to you. So, in a sense, the history of independent features, these few features being made in New York in the 30s, is almost kind of a sad story of people knocking their head against the wall. But they did create something. They created a model for making feature films that was a little more like the European style. I'm going to get a story together. I'll raise money. I will rent a studio. There's a studio. I will rent the cameras and lights. Are you available, actors, directors? This is not the way things worked in Hollywood. In Hollywood, they spent decades sort of refining the efficiencies of mass production, a film factory. Maybe that worked for a while in the 30s, wasn't going to work anymore after the war. Products had to be individualized, both in terms of what market they were directed at and how they would be put together. That's a technique that had to be developed and learned, and it was developed and learned in New York. So that when things get bad in Hollywood and production is going to run away, well, why did it run away to New York, where things were still going to be more expensive? It came to New York because New York had maintained the infrastructure. It had maintained trained union cadres, right? It had cultural roots and a tradition of filmmaking, unbroken, went back to the end of the 19th century. Paramount Pictures went into receivership during the bottom of the Depression, and they had to move out of the studio in Astoria. And Astoria studio was taken over by one of their big creditors, Western Electric. They owed Western Electric a lot of money because they had put sound equipment and stuff in. So Western Electric basically owned and operated that studio. And they said, we're going to rent this out for independent productions. What they were looking for was a way of getting small budget producers, whether they were making shorts or features, to use their sound equipment instead of RCA's sound equipment, which was the competition. So they said, we have a studio, and if you use our equipment, we'll loan you money. We have a revolving capital fund, right? This is a new way of making movies. You don't have to finance the year's output for MGM or Fox. We will loan independent producers money, one picture at a time, at reasonable rates. All you have to do is use our studio and our sound equipment. Okay, this is a very good deal, and people start to go to take advantage of it. This is really key, not only to the understanding the history of why there's a movie industry in New York now, but why the American film industry changed from the classic Hollywood studio system of the 1930s and 40s to whatever it is we have today, which in fact is more efficient economically. They make more money than they ever did, you know, back in Louis B. Mayer's day.